Do you ever worry about the uncertainty of the future?
I've spent my whole life scared, frightened of things that could happen, might not happen. 40 years I spent like that, finding myself awake at 3 in the morning.
You are 40. You started the day you were born?
But you know what? Ever since this podcast, I sleep just fine. When I came to realize is that it's fear. Fear is the worst of it. That's the real enemy. So get up, get out in the real world, and you kick it as hard as you can, right in the teeth.
Welcome to It's About Nothing. All right. Cam, you've got the misfortune of having to acknowledge that you've never watched Breaking Bad before.
Yeah, and there's no reason for that. It's on my list of shows to watch, and actually my partner, I guess he watched it before we got together. I'm not sure, but he's a big fan of it. So I promise you I will watch it. It's sort of like Mad Men. I had that on my list for a long time to watch, and then I finally did sit down and watch it, I think, after it was done, and I really got into it. So
the reason I selected that one today was that I was interested in a good quote about uncertainty. And this is obviously a good quote from a very well-known series, Walter White, whose alter ego in the series is Heisenberg. And as we know, as you and I discussed before, Heisenberg invented the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And it's something that I won't even pretend to try and understand or explain.
No, me either.
Now, are there any other television shows that people, first of all, do you think that it's everyone or just a select number of people who actually chastise others about not watching particular television shows that are out?
Oh God, yeah. It happens all the time, don't you think? Actually, earlier this year, do you remember that show Tiger King? Everyone, we watched it actually, but everyone sort of became obsessed with the show Tiger King. And then, it was during that brief period where people were still allowed to go out and socialize, pretty unfettered in large numbers. So that was the discussion point. So I think sometimes you can definitely feel left out of a loop, whether it's in the workplace or in your social circle, whatever it is, if you're not watching a particular show, or heaven forbid, if you don't like a particular show.
That's even worse, I think.
Yeah, you might have gone and checked it out and not liked it. So that's the thing too. I think it happens a lot.
Yeah. If these are the shows that everyone sort of gets behind, and I've actually seen them, by the way, so I'm not going to make you feel bad. But
okay.
You tell me if there's any of these that you haven't seen, and
that I have not seen.
That you haven't seen. So there's Game of Thrones. You've definitely seen that. Yep. And you've read the books, yeah?
I have read the books, yes.
That's a tick. There's The Wire.
I have not. And I know that's another really big one. That's some people say that was the best show ever made. And that's another one on my list.
Yeah, there's The Wire. And let me think. There's another one. There's another one floating around. No, well, I've got one that I assumed everyone had seen, that I discovered one of my friends hasn't seen, and I was quite disappointed, and he could not get into it to your point.
Was it Seinfeld?
It was Seinfeld.
Yeah.
He watched lots of episodes, and he just said, look, I just don't get it.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, actually. I had this kind of unofficial but official dating rule years ago when I was still dating. It was basically if someone didn't like The Simpsons, I didn't really think there'd be much of a future with that person. And Seinfeld was probably in that category as well. And, they sometimes say if you grew up in the 90s and actually watched Seinfeld, in its era, you're either a Seinfeld person or a Friends person. Mm-hmm. And I never cared for the show Friends, actually. To me, it just never... I've tried to watch it since. What's that?
It was from that sort of era, though.
Yeah, definitely. It was the same era. And it was also set in New York, but it was just a completely different experience, which was interesting.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing now, if you watch the old sitcoms of the 90s, the 80s or 90s, about how many of those shows wouldn't work anymore with the current technology, because with smartphones, none of them have smartphones in the 90s. So they have to do things like They can't just call someone or text them, and they have to actually meet as well. They have to meet and have coffee and to catch
Seinfeld's
up.
based on people just continually dropping into Jerry's apartment, really. Like they're always there.
Yeah, well, Jerry Seinfeld said that the character of Kramer today, if the show was made today, Kramer would never leave his apartment.
No, he'd be online all the time, wouldn't he?
He'd be online, he'd be on Facebook and all the social media stuff.
That's true. Could you remember those really early episodes? I think they played up the idea of Kramer being a recluse a lot more. Like there's even one early episode where Jerry says to him, "You haven't left the building for 20 years or something like that." So yeah, that idea was always floating around. But in the 21st century, you could definitely get away with it.
Indeed. So we were talking about uncertainty, and I thought about Breaking Bad, and then uncertainty sort of fits in nicely there. I like that quote that from Walter White, which we've kind of adapted a little bit, of course, but it is all about. Well, it's actually very similar. It's a more long-winded version of "There's nothing to fear but fear itself." I think
Roosevelt. Yeah, actually, I thought of that. When we were discussing it earlier,
and our guest today is somebody who, let's say, he doesn't just dabble in uncertainty. His whole career is in many ways helping people navigate uncertainty and extremely complex environments. Yeah. So it's Marvin Oka, and he's an international business consultant. So he's been doing this for quite a while now, 35 years. He's got a particular niche field called, it's applying neurobehavioral modeling. So he'll talk a little bit about that today as well, about what that actually means. And he tends to work works in complex environments, usually with leaders or in strategic sessions to try and unravel the path forward and understand, well, not unravel, maybe create a path forward, maybe unravel what was once there and try and find a way forward. And one of the reasons we wanted to discuss uncertainty today, and that discussion that's pretty much at the top of everyone's mind, is we're looking at what's happening now to the world with the pandemic, and what do businesses have to do now in order to survive, because it isn't just a small incremental change we're dealing with. It's a complete transformation in so many industries now. And so one of the things I discussed with Marvin the other day, which we can chat about later, was like just how certain industries are not just going through, say, a sort of a downturn. They might have to be completely radically transformed in the next 12 months, like real estate, for example, commercial real estate in the city, things like that. So Marvin is joining us, and I think, is Marvin, are you there?
Yes, hello.
So welcome to the show.
Welcome, Marvin.
Great, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Cam. Great to be here.
So Marvin, in terms of in dealing with complexity, is there anything at the moment that's of interest? Anything topical you're dealing with that you're allowed to talk about that might be of interest? Anything particularly challenging?
I think it's what's most prominent is just obviously the nature of the global system in play that we all are a part of, obviously. And a lot of people are wrestling with the idea of when does it stabilize? When does it get back to the way that it was? And the odds are pretty likely that it's not going to go back the way that it was, not completely anyway. There'll be certain aspects of the system that will stabilize. And to be honest, it could look to some degree a bit like how it was before, but it won't exactly be the way that it was before, because the larger planetary social economic system has changed. And as a result, what we're going to start to see as well is the emergence of entirely new opportunities, sometimes entirely new industries, new forms of ways to do business, and people that are stuck in a mindset of how do I do the way I was doing business before in this new world. At best, they might luck out. They might be in a particular business that is going to still be okay or even thrive in the changing environment. But for the most part, most people will need to upgrade how they think business works and how they think life works. And I think what we're seeing as instability is actually exactly how systems change.
Do you think, I remember in some organizations I've been in, there were people who had the title sort of crisis managers, and they usually didn't get much attention because it was the sort of things they were talking about sounded like catastrophes. And a lot of people kind of go, oh, well, that may happen, but let's deal with reality. Let's deal with what could happen tomorrow, not what could happen in once in 100-year event. Do you think that the field of like crisis management will get a little bit more attention, or would that change, do you think? Or do you think people take it more seriously now?
I think the area of crisis management itself is a great example of one that needs to also redefine what it is and how it actually works. Mm-hmm. When the environment's relatively stable, then crisis is basically a disruption to the status quo. And your job is essentially, how do we recover? How do we make sure that we have business continuity? How do we make sure we've got disaster recovery plans, damage control, et cetera, and get back to an even keel? Whereas when you are looking at systemic complexity and you're looking at a range of things that's all shifting and we have multiple interdependent variables that are in play, this nature of instability is suggesting that the whole system will eventually reach a threshold point where, not all at once, but there'll be aspects, you'll see signs of it in different parts of the system, where it will reach a threshold where it either has to evolve or it has to collapse. It's always that threshold point that starts to occur. And therefore, what constitutes a crisis could be something that is, okay, we do need to do a traditional form of damage control or business continuity, et cetera. Or the environment is now suggesting, or the signal, the crisis is now suggesting that the environment has so sufficiently changed around us that it's not a sign of business continuity or damage control. It's actually a sign that we need to evolve. We need to transform our business with new ways of thinking. We need to redefine our value proposition, how our business works, redefine our business models, et cetera. And so we're now going to see the probably several different facets of quote unquote crisis management. One is, as I said, traditional form, and another is, oh no, how do we actually now steer through this time of turbulence and instability so that we can actually grow and evolve into something new, a new value proposition back to our larger ecosystem.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. Like, we are conditioned perhaps to think of crises as short-term disruptions, short-term things, and then we go back to normal. So like last summer, before COVID became a big reality, we had bushfires here in Australia. That's something that we sort of expect to have every summer, and then we go back to normal when the weather cools down. Essentially, we can talk about, them becoming more frequent and that sort of thing. So perhaps what you're saying suggests to me that we need to think more in terms of adaptation rather than a short-term management, style of approach.
Yes. Now there's two, you highlight a really important word there, Cam. So there's two forms of adaptation. Right? In fact, well, there's multiple, depends how to work with it, but there's a level where you are simply modifying what you do to fit your changing circumstances. So you're adapting to fit your current environment differently. So that has how a lot of people, most businesses are going about it today, which is they're trying to figure out, okay, how do I now move a lot of my offerings online, for instance? And that's a form of how do I adapt to these changing conditions if I'm in a lockdown and I now can't interface directly face-to-face with clients or customers, how do I have to do this online? And so it's a modification, so to speak. I've also seen many businesses maladapt, where they actually adapt in a way that makes them less than what they were previously. They're smaller. They're more confined. They're now limited in their revenue channels, for instance. But there's another form of adaptation. So this previous one I've just been talking about is what we would call first order adaptation. So it's the system doesn't really change, or your paradigm or your culture or your business model, your way of thinking doesn't really change. It just tweaks and it tries to adjust. Whereas there's a form of adaptation that is a second order adaptation, which is evolution, which is how do we actually now transform? It's also called vertical change. How do we actually now evolve to a new level where we not only are able to better fit the changing circumstances, but we can actually thrive in it because we've actually now are better suited to it because we've evolved ourselves to that. And that's the area of what typically people mean when they use the word transformation. But I think, Cam, I know you would be aware, and Nick, you would be aware that when businesses often use the word transformation, it's not really a transformation.
Yeah. But I mean, that perhaps speaks to a larger problem. Often we use words, we say we're doing things without really knowing what we mean by it, because it looks good. So, yeah.
I was having a laugh with my dad the other day about the way people use language, because we exaggerate basically. But you think, and someone who loves to use exaggerate the words would talk about Donald Trump, and how he said something like, we're going to, there's tremendous litigation happening. It's just this, it's such an amazing way of describing such a run-of-the-mill sort of process.
Yeah, tremendous litigation.
Yeah, like as if it's like some big Hollywood production that's happening.
Yeah. Well, from his point of view, it sort of is. We were up in a hotel in Sydney the other week, and obviously we haven't done a lot of traveling, so that was a novelty. And there was a big sign in the lobby saying, "We are COVID safe," which and I'm sure in one sense they are. Like, they obviously had certain measures in place, like staff were wearing masks and they had hand sanitizer sort of everywhere. But it's interesting that they put that up, and then I take a certain level of reassurance from that. And then, from an uncertainty point of view, like, they're not providing 100% guarantee that I won't contract COVID in their hotel, obviously. So if that were to happen and I were to sue them because they had a sign saying "We are COVID safe," I don't think I'd get very far with my tremendous litigation necessarily. But, but we feel kind of reassured by seeing these things, don't we?
Yeah, we do. We can feel either falsely reassured, but we can also end up being falsely thrown into the word you mentioned previously, where most times when organizations use the word crisis, for instance, it's not a crisis at all. Very few things, probably up until the lockdowns, very few things actually threaten the entire business existence. Whereas things like an extreme lockdown for extended periods of time it actually is can be a legitimate crisis. But whether or not this is a bad thing, is this a crisis to be avoided or recovered from, or is this simply how the system is showing where its dysfunctionality is, and it's showing up in forms of instability? And we're talking now about the political, economic, social system. When we start to now see this, it's showing that this is now the time for change. We spoke about the word transformation because most people, as you rightfully said, they use words they don't really understand what they're saying. And most businesses, when they say we need business transformation or business process transformation, or we need whatever type of transformation, most times they actually don't want that, because what they often don't realize is, in order for a system to transform, it's not going to really transform and evolve until it goes through a period of maximum instability. And when it goes through maximum instability is when the older system can then fall away and the newer system can arise, and hence we get a transformation. Whereas most businesses are after continuity, certainty, stability, and it's often anathema to real transformation.
It's a very good point. I mean, as you know, Marvin and Nick, like in the political international context, crisis is often what necessarily precedes great change. So like the international system that we currently have was largely created after 1945, the United Nations, the sort of, international economic system, the IMF, all those institutions were born out of the ravages of World War II. But they sort of had to have that level of, destruction and international calamity in order to get to that point.
There's something interesting happening, I think, in the US. I don't know if you agree, but especially, so before, not to make too many comments about Trump, because we're probably all tired of hearing about him, but before he won the election, he was certainly portraying the American system as being in a crisis that needs to return back to tradition, and he was suggesting that he communicated this, I think, really well to his base, which was that the idea that the politicians can't be trusted, and we have to think in more traditional values about business, and he's not part of the broken system. So he kind of portrayed it like that. And then when he was in power, the other side portrayed everything he was doing as a crisis. And now they're talking about how, like, Biden's coming in saying, now everything's going to settle down. There's going to be peace. We've restored the crisis that was happening during this presidency. And to what extent are political leaders or our political parties, maybe not as much in Australia, but to a lesser extent perhaps, creating a sense of crisis before leading up to elections to make it not just, I'll come in and do some changes, but we've actually got a major crisis on our hands with this party who's leading, so we have to do something about it. It's an emergency.
Yeah, well, we've talked before on this show about negative campaigning to some extent. So that's classic negative campaigning. So if you're a political strategist, you find a crisis, maybe you even concoct or exaggerate a crisis, and you use that as a rallying point. So you identify this crisis, you identify a problem and propose yourself as a solution to it. So it's not you can campaign on a more positive agenda and say, we're going to do all these wonderful things, but a lot of research suggests that voters are pretty susceptible to negative campaigning. Like, you can go too negative and sort of, overcorrect in that way. But often if you can convince a group of people that the government currently in charge are really messing things up, maybe they feel that way anyway. And if you can sort of play to those concerns, that's often a way to win an election.
Yeah, you highlight such an important point, Cam, that there's so much research exactly based on what you just said. There's also some fascinating things around I don't know if you've ever heard this term called a post-truth world or post.
Yeah.
And I believe, I forget if it was either Merriam-Webster or Oxford or one of the dictionaries. All the dictionaries every year coin their own word of the year. And I think somewhere 2015 or 2016, or one of the dictionaries coined post-truth as their word of the year. Yeah. And it basically, if any of your listeners don't know what that term means, it's basically when you are, it's no longer about reporting things as facts or truth. It's all about trying to stimulate and provoke emotions, and everything is more the emotional content. And in a post-truth world, all the media, all the news, all the issues at play are more emotionally driven than they are fact-based. And you're absolutely right that it's a lot easier to provoke people into action if you can get their emotions riled up. And there's a lot of research to show that more people are going to get active in what's called the move away from direction, when there's something that they don't want compared to something that they think is positive that they do want. But at the same time, you also right, Cam, that you can't overdo it. If people go too much into the negative for too long, they just switch off after a while.
Yeah. You raise a really good point there, though, Marvin. What we're dealing with now is this post-truth world, choose your own facts to some extent.
Yes.
And it does blur a lot of lines, I think.
Yeah, well, certainly I think in social media, it's very easy to communicate graphs and charts and things that people will just look at. I was looking at one before and I was thinking, this is very compelling, but I have no idea where this came from, what it means. But these things get passed around. And even if it was accurate, it's like, you go, yes, but there could be another 100 charts that dispute it as well. So, it's interesting. It's like, where do you find your source of truth, really, if you can't rely on information that's shared? And is it peer-reviewed journals? And then you look at that and you go, yes, maybe, but it's possibly that maybe the scientific method flushes it out eventually, because if you fake a journal article, then someone eventually will come along and try and replicate your study and will say it didn't work. That's how that system corrects itself.
It's a really challenging one. So if you've ever done any teaching before, especially with, undergraduate students, you have to walk them through this process of identifying useful material and, that they can use in making an argument in an essay or something like that, and material that's not useful. And I think it's getting harder and harder, actually, because there's more information out there than there was before, which in a way is a good thing. And there's so many pieces of information that are literally at a student's fingertips without them having to go to the library. I mean, I used to tease students a little bit about the library, that they should go there and they should access these dusty old things on the shelves called books, but they can find so many things on their laptop or even on their phone or whatever it is. But then sort of establishing whether that's something with merit can be hard. And peer-reviewed journals are fantastic on one level, obviously, but then even that cannot not always be, you know, completely robust. And then you are dealing with, like, I've had students write essays when I was teaching, they quote Wikipedia or something like that. So then you have to engage with that student and kind of explain to them that academically that has no merit whatsoever. But if you go through the footnotes of that Wikipedia article and maybe trace it back, you might actually find something of value.
Well, Wikipedia is an interesting system, not to go too far off topic, because it's got a built-in course correction in that they've got people, like the masses of people go in and they challenge and they're constantly questioning.
Yeah.
And whether or not, because like sometimes you do hop on Wikipedia and you read about a topic and you go, you know what, this is a pretty solid coverage of this, all of these people who've got a deep interest in some matter. They spend, hours writing these things. It's actually incredible. Just going back to this concept first of second order change. So tell me, what are you able to describe, Marvin? What are the characteristics you look for to say that, like, let's say a system is in a state of, I guess, distress? Like, when do you just go, oh no, that's just a few teething problems. You're just going through normal, everyday business as usual, communication issues, change management issues. What are those characteristics you look for where you go, right, this whole system is ready to basically collapse in on itself unless we evolve? What would you look for?
Okay, this is a big question because there's a lot to cover just so someone can understand it properly, because there's a shallow level. I could explain it in a very simple way, but it'll sort of miss the point if I do it that way. First thing is, let's understand the concepts that are in play. So change isn't just change. There are many different types of change depending upon how you want to filter and how you want to label it. In this particular context, let's start off with the distinction between first versus second order change. So a first order change is any change inside of an existing system or an existing culture or an existing paradigm, an existing way of thinking, whatever it might be. Now, I've discovered over the years that there are 4 types of first order change that are typically seen. Now, at best, a first order change can be improvement. So any improvement makes the system work better, but the system itself doesn't change per se. It's just now better in the way that it was doing itself. Nothing wrong with good first order improvement, right? So let's get that clear. More often than not, a typical first order change is much ado about nothing. It's the classic rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And if anyone's been in large corporates for any length of years, you will all have seen major change programs come through after literally millions of dollars has been spent over several years. At the end of the day, nothing's changed. It's still the same. The culture hasn't shifted. The ways of doing things are still the same. Classic first order change. Sometimes a first order change a third type is a fix it. Things aren't broken, or things don't work anymore. Let's get it back to, it was working. Let's get it back to the way it was working. And sometimes that's a legitimate form of a good first order change. And if all that's needed, terrific, not a problem. Now, the fourth type is most problematic. And the fourth type of first order change is any changes to the system that make it harder for real second order change to actually occur. It embeds the system more solidly. A classic example of this, by the way, is our election cycles. I don't care almost what country you're in, right? If you've got a short-term election cycle, for most in Western civilizations, Western countries, it might be every 4 years or so. Great, we're going to go for change. But as long as we're wedded to this four-year cycle, election cycle, it's really difficult for real second order change to actually ever really occur. Things like remunerating CEOs off of performance, straight sales or revenue performance, make it really difficult for changes to occur, because what happens is obviously they are wedded to getting the remuneration package. And then after a certain period of time, as long as the numbers look good and they leave and they get all their bonuses, Well, what does that now tell the next person in charge? The next person in charge is not about to rock the boat because the system works. They know this. They know how to go and get their payout at the end of their tenure. And so these types of things where, let's change the CEO, and what we're going to do is entice them with this wonderful remuneration package. Well, that's a classic example of bedding down the system even harder. Now, a second order change is a change to the system. The system itself actually changes, it evolves. The culture actually changes, or the organization actually changes, or the structure of a system actually changes, or your way of thinking completely changes and transforms. Now, that's not always needed, but when it's needed, the signs are going to be when the system itself is problematic. The system itself is creating its own problems to the detriment of everyone involved in that particular system. When you're starting to see an organization getting increasingly more toxic, for instance, I've seen organizations where the culture was just toxic. It was just not healthy by anyone's standards. You know, people end up being cynical, bitter, and twisted in their psychology within a very short span of time. So-called high-performance organizations, which really, for most places, when they use that term, it means sales-driven. Is usually what it means. And when that occurs and people are just chasing the almighty outcome, the revenue outcome, it can very easily turn into a dog-eat-dog world, or if you're not competent, you suddenly drop down the respect ladder considerably, etc. So when the system itself is problematic, and the system is now going into signs of perturbation, so to speak, the system is starting to try every combination it can to try and maintain itself. That's where we're starting to see signs that second order change is both needed and it's potentially coming. Now, what happens is in any living system, like an organization filled with living people, a family, a couple, or even yourself in many ways, all living systems, in addition to moving towards growth, etc., they also move towards homeostasis. They move towards balance. And this is why systems, as large organizations, are notoriously difficult to quote unquote change, because it's got so many ways to try and maintain itself, as it should. Otherwise, the system is quote unquote unstable. And so managers are trained, Western managers are trained for stability, certainty, and they want to stabilize everything. And in order to stabilize everything, they try and tighten up quote unquote controls. And as they start to control harder and harder and micromanage more and more sometimes, now good controls are great. You have to have controls, don't get me wrong, right? But when there's an over-reliance on controls because the system, a problematic or dysfunctional system seems to be wobbling, so to speak, it's producing undesirable results. Instead of figuring out how to evolve the system, most managers tighten up on controls. And they think that's the answer, which is it's the fourth type of first order change. It's going to make it harder for things to actually to change, because the very metrics are driving the problem, right? Yeah. And so what a system will do is it tries to maintain itself, that when the larger ecosystem that it belongs to is changing around it, and now the organism has to literally grow or die. It has to evolve or go extinct. The business has to grow or it's going to go bankrupt. A relationship has to redefine itself or it's going to go into divorce. You're going to see the same pattern evolve or occur in a system. What the system will try and do before it evolves is it will try every combination it knows in how to maintain itself. And what you're going to see is the system trying to lock down harder. It's going to try and assert what it knows harder. And this is where, if you come in too early, and I know Cam and Nick, I know you are both change agents of a type. If you go into an organization now at this stage when they're just starting to feel the pressure, and you say, "Hey, I've got an idea of how we can completely transform the system," you're not going to be received very well. Right? They're not going to be open because they haven't exhausted every opportunity to try and maintain themselves, which is what they're trying to do. Right? So when we start to see all of these first order attempts, where you've probably seen it in large organizations, people that are sitting there as employees and staff, they can look at some edict coming down from management and they know it's not going to work. They know very early on, they can tell you, this is not going to work, and management will try it anyway. And lo and behold, it won't work. And at some point, some poor consultant will get blamed as the scapegoat for this thing or whatever it might be. And they'll try every combination to maintain itself. And it's not until they are, as I mentioned earlier, the system is at maximum instability is when it's most malleable to actual real transformational change. We can explain it in physical systems. Ilya Prigogine won a Nobel Prize for his theory of dissipative structures. We're starting to see that, for instance, in just a pot of boiling water, right? Pressure gets applied, heat gets applied to the water. The water molecules try and maintain themselves as water. They start vibrating. The system goes into perturbation. It starts shaking, rattling, and rolling until at some point, as long as the pressure doesn't come off, the pressure stays on, the system has to transform, and it changes form. It goes from liquid to gas. It turns into steam, is a new form that can dissipate the energy, right? And so you'll start to see that what the system will try and do to maintain itself is it will try everything to dissipate the stress or the energy. And it can come anywhere from, let's fix something, let's fire somebody, let's blame it on them. Obviously, we'll get rid of the cognitive dissonance that way.
Yeah.
They'll try out little things, and as soon as they see a minor improvement, it's like, the heat is slightly off, we're okay. And that's where an improvement can actually delay a necessary transformational process that's actually required. And your tip will be, you have to see the strategic business fit to its larger ecosystem. If it still fits, first order change is fine. We're okay, right? But if the system around it, if its larger business ecosystem has shifted dramatically to the point where the business system itself is now out of date, it's not adding sufficient value back to the larger ecosystem, that's when second order change is required, and you will see the very predictable first order moves that will come into play. And the key is you have to keep the pressure on. Do not take the pressure off. Because if you do, the system will just slow down again and come back to homeostasis. That's what it's going to keep trying to do.
I wonder where people fit into this. I know they do. Organizations tend to be made up of people, and we often talk about whether people can change. There's different views on that. And I've seen organizations, government departments, for example, and they've tried to drive cultural change to varying degrees of success, but ultimately the same people have sort of been there essentially, particularly at the top. So, and people below or in the middle are perhaps a bit cynical about it because it might be the third or fourth time in 10 years they've kind of seen this happen. But do you sometimes have to take people out in order to affect real change? And I don't just mean one or two people at the top, but I mean something broader than that. And also, do we have to accept that sometimes change takes a really long time? Some forms of change may necessarily happen really quickly, but I'm thinking actually of cultural change within the military. It's very topical at the moment because of the allegations that have come out about the SAS. And I don't particularly want to dwell on that, but I know as someone who I have worked with the military before, and one thing when I was teaching at the Defence Force Academy was they were really trying to improve culture between men and women. And part of the problem there in a way was just there's way more many men than women in the military, and it's probably always going to be the case. But over time, there will be more women, and that will change the balance of power between men and women in the organisation. But it might take 10 or 20 years for that to happen. So I think there's a question wrapped up in there somewhere.
There's actually a lot there. We need to unpack it a lot. So if you're ready to go deep on that one. So first thing, because I've spent many years, many decades actually looking at this notion of culture. And way back in the late 80s, there wasn't a whole lot, particularly around organizational culture. I think there might have been only one or two books. There might have been Edgar Stein's book, and I think maybe one out of Holland, and that was about it at the time. But the challenge is that the majority of them will approach quote unquote culture as a sociological, from a sociological lens. And when I approached it from a neurobehavioral modeling lens, I could see it very, very differently. So first thing is that culture is, again, borrowing from systems language as well, culture is an emergent property. Now, what does that mean? So a culture is not a thing. It doesn't exist as a tangible thing in the organization. It is a set of properties, characteristics, qualities that arise because of the how the agents, how the people are all interacting and relating to each other within a particular context. And so we get that phenomenon, whether they're overly polite or whether they're toxic or whether they are high performance or whatever it might be. And it's the classic phrase of the way we do things around here. So what drives that? What constitutes that? Which is why when people talk about a cultural change, often it's like what we talked about earlier, Cam, people are using words that they don't know what they're actually saying, right? Most times when they say we want cultural change, they don't. What they're actually after is compliance.
Yeah.
They just want people to do what they think they ought to be doing with the attitude they should have.
It would be a lot easier if they just
came exactly. It'll be a lot easier if they just thought like me. Exactly.
Marvin, it's given that culture is emergent, and I agree with you. I often say to clients as well that don't get too hung up on culture. It's often a red herring. Like, just don't get so caught up in it. Even though I think all of us could agree that culture is the essence of the business. Trying to treat it like a thing that you can manipulate and shift around in a couple of months or in 6 months even is very difficult. You can make changes. This is maybe those first order changes within the system, but you can't radically shift the culture unless somebody comes in and decides they're going to fire everyone and bring a whole new staff in, and then by default it will be a new culture.
Yes, exactly. You're spot on in terms of very similar to the approach I've been taking around the neurobehavioral modeling side of things, which is it is a furphy. It is a red herring to try and chase culture because it's an emergent property, and that if you really did want to shift those emergent properties, you don't look at culture. You don't look at the emergent properties themselves. You look at all the critical agents that's actually creating that or making that arise. So in living systems theory, you're looking for what's called loop dominance. You're looking for what are the core feedback loops that's happening within the system that the whole system is revolving around. And it won't be many. It'll be literally less than a handful. It's very rare to even be more than three. Right? 3 core loops that you have to address, that if you don't address, nothing's going to change around here. But if you do address it, the whole system will reorganize differently. It'll reshape itself accordingly. And it could mean different people, exactly as you're saying, Cam and Nick. It could mean different key people need to be there, or it could be different structures or systems that need to be in place. Now, in relation to what you said earlier, Cam, how long does it take? It totally is dependent upon the ecosystem that they're in and the current state of perturbation that they're in. So some cultures are naturally, they're in an environment that is naturally, or I should say is inherently dynamic, flux, constantly changing, etc. So the capacity to actually shift a cultural viewpoint or a cultural way of the way we do things around here could actually be quite not as difficult, probably is the best way to say it, because the nature of people that would show up in that industry are that particular way. Some very high-tech companies that live and breathe agile, for instance, if you actually said we need to shift, most of them are kind of ready for it. It's kind of like terrific. Not only are we ready for it, we have ways to do it. And so they're quite ready for that. Certain industries, their ecosystem is not changing anytime soon. So if you want a cultural change, good luck, because there's no pressure to actually say that that's actually going to shift to that particular way. Despite all the movements towards renewable energies and things of that nature, fossil fuels probably is not changing that dramatically that soon, right? As much as people would like it to, it's probably not going to for a long mining. It might have new technology, et cetera, but that's probably still going to happen like how it is for a very long time. And very similarly, warfare, right? Yeah. Now, when it comes to second order change, a tool that can change how things work, for instance, will be things like, what many sociological researchers point to in the Vietnam War. And what made the Vietnam War different from all the other wars was television. Now, television was a very second order tool, because once the populace could now see images of what was happening over there, suddenly everybody then went, why are we doing this? We don't want to be there. Bring our boys back. We don't belong in Vietnam. Get us out of there.
Yeah, right? That's a very good point.
Until they actually saw it. And so things can shift. But until then, it was like, well, we go to war and we do what war has to be like, right?
Yeah, there's a difference between numbers on a page in terms of casualties, but actually having that beamed into your lounge room every night.
Yeah, or you see, the image on Life magazine of the person with a gun to their head.
Yeah.
And you know that a few seconds later that guy was dead, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, well, okay, gee whiz, right? You're gonna evoke very, very different reactions this way. So in terms of how long does it take, it totally is dependent on conditions. Some cultural changes can happen quite quickly. And these are times when you have a different leadership style or leadership fit is appropriate to the culture and the organizational needs. If you have high pressure for change and the organization is ready for it, then a charismatic leader can actually work wonders, right? But in a change, in an environment where it's slow moving and the culture is pretty staid and it's been successful for many, many decades, a charismatic leader just seems like a wanker out there. Right? You need a leader that's going to be much more work slowly, work more through conversation, gently see things over time, and it may take years before people are ready to actually entertain a new idea.
Yeah.
Right? So it's totally dependent, but it is a key thing. Now, I was clued into this many years back when someone said, "You ever notice with culture that that names and faces can come and go, but the culture stays the same?" And I thought about it and I went, yes, that's absolutely right. Now, how is that possible? As the neurobehavioral modeling side of me took over, how is that possible? So if I was a new recruit and I came into your organization, how do I know how to behave? How do I know how to become part of this culture, right? Why doesn't the whole world change just because I showed up, right? And I started to notice, well, because you're looking for specific cues in your environment. And I started to create a whole list of different types of cues and different organizations. Some of these cues have different currency than others. So some of these cues are more important than others than in another organization. So for some of them, it will be things like who's in charge and what style do they have in their leadership. For others, it'll be things like the physical space and the physical environment. For other things, it'll be the structures and procedures they work to. For almost all of them, one of the critical ones will be the metrics that they're held accountable to, their actual measures. That they're held accountable to. So I don't care what management espouses as their strategic goals and aspirations. At the end of the day, what am I going to get paid for? And what do I get my butt kicked for? That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Right. And what's amazing is that another major part of this as well around culture is the storylines that are occurring, which is another way a system can neutralize changes, which is especially in large organizations. Believe it or not, people say, what do you think is the primary driver for behavior in this organization? And people will often say things like the performance goal, like achieving your goals, right? Achieving what you said and hitting your targets.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. I have seen large organizations do nothing of the sort, where they espouse goals, they've got metrics, they've got people accountable to targets. And I have discovered in many organizations, large ones, if you have a good enough story to justify why you didn't hit your target, you're okay.
And this is well known within the organization.
Usually not. No, usually not. As a modeler, though, I can see where, wow, what's holding the system together is not its structures, not its necessarily its metrics, but it's the narratives that are in play, the narratives that hold currency that's in play. And if you can talk the narrative that people will buy in and say, oh, okay, we'll go with that truth over the other ones, you're good.
There was a job I had a few years ago where I worked with this guy. He'd been around a while, and this is in the public service. And he said, and they were sending around this spreadsheet, and they were asking you to put the details of your project that you're working on, the dates that you're delivering certain things by, and thank you very much, we'll take those away. And he came up to me and said, I know this game. I've seen this game many times. I put some numbers down there, and then 2 weeks later, I get a spreadsheet coming back with things in red. Says, so what you do is you just don't put anything in there, and you never actually fill out the spreadsheet, and then they can't hold you accountable for it.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other one as well, I think is quite interesting is, and this is also a problem with negative reinforcement with leaders, is if you put a line item on a schedule to red, you've now reached the worst level of performance. You basically can't get any worse than that. It can't go more red. It goes red, and that's it. And so the next time you meet and you present and something's in red, well, we already you've already had the wrap over the knuckles over it last week. They're not going to do it again because you've already missed the target. So it actually stops to be a reinforcer.
That's a good point.
Yes.
And then, of course, the leaders who have already, like, for instance, if you're a manager and you chastise someone enough, it'll get to a point where they just think, well, that person's already made up their mind, therefore I'm not going to work any harder because I've already been. What's the point? I'm seem to be getting by anyway, even though I'm not performing. So I love, all of those things. I think when you bring them up, I always think to myself, I can definitely see that in so many workplaces, and yet we still do them all the time. Like, people keep using them all the time. And isn't that interesting? Like, is that because people think that they work? Or is it that they just don't have any better ideas and they think that this is the way an organization has to work?
Yeah, I think that it's because of they're just not aware. They don't understand how things actually work. And so you've brought such a brilliant example. So, in that world of you're saying people don't understand negative reinforcement, that this is the world of behavioral shaping. And so I often use a term instead of cultural change. I use the term around cultural shaping, because that's what happens. People their behaviors get shaped into norming how we are to interact with each other and relate with each other, etc. And one of the key things around behavioral shaping is recognizing that what constitutes reward and punishment is in the eye of the beholder. Right. And so exactly what you're saying is, like, someone thinks, well, if I berate the person, I'll get them to go into action. Well, actually, no. In the eye of the beholder, the person receiving the berating, you're just teaching them, stop trying, because it's not going to get any better from here. Right. You'll see it as well in so many organizations where, let's say you become a high performer and you're doing some great work, and you bust your backside, and you always deliver on time, and you go the extra mile, and you do all those kind of things. What is your reward? And in many organizations, your reward is more work.
Yeah.
People kind of go, great, this person gets it done, give it to them.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if you slack off and you do the minimum that's required, what happens? People look at you and people kind of say, well, this person, they're not going to get it done, so don't give it to them. So essentially, you get rewarded for being a slacker. Well, you don't get the extra work, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the person who's doing all the extra work, they get punished for high performance from their viewpoint. They get extra work loaded onto them. And it's because people don't understand how behavioral shaping actually works, and they think, well, we need to hammer them down. I see it so many times. It's about performance management. We need to get them to follow the procedures and follow the rules. And you kind of go, well, no, there's a reason why they're not, right? And that hammering them is not good negative reinforcement. That doesn't actually work. I'll give a great example of this as well. One of my all-time classic. I love this story. I couldn't believe it when I was sitting at an executive leadership team meeting, and this happened before my eyes. Right? There's a major organization. I'll keep them nameless. They had a person in charge for a process transformation work, and they had several processes that, in their language was, the processes were broken, and the person's job was to, quote unquote, fix it. Right? And the executive team hammered this person, and they said, you've been on this project for 6 months now, and the processes are still broken. When are you going to fix them? And his response, and he was 100% serious, right? And he said, the processes are not broken. The processes work. It's just that the people don't do them.
Classic.
It was stunning.
The political equivalent of that is the policies weren't wrong. It's just the electorate was wrong. Like they didn't vote the right way.
Exactly.
Repeated. Yeah.
Hey, Marvin, that's a great. I love that. I mean, I'm not. I see variations of that same theme all the time. It's always the case that if people would just follow these processes or procedures, things would work out. When you're talking about the reward and punishment stuff, I thought that was quite interesting, because it reminds me of something I heard about how if you want to, I guess, demotivate someone or make them feel bad, you punish them. But if you really want to punish them, you punish them for doing good things. you punish them for achievement.
Yes.
And that's if you really want to screw someone up.
If you want to demoralize them, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And I was just sort of reflecting on the fact that I can remember one. I can think of actually two examples. I'll just say one, but I was when I was studying, I was serving in the shoe department at Myer, and there was no customers. It was a really quiet day, and we used to have like a big box of odd shoes out the back, and it was puzzling because we could never figure out how did we get so many odd shoes. There would be like 100 shoes there, and what would happen is they just get thrown out. So you can imagine, you just look at this system is obviously broken. Something's happening. Someone's taking home an odd pair and not realizing it. We don't know what's happening. So I sort of was looking around at the time. I was very interested in usability and everything, and I was looking at all the boxes thinking, well, one of the problems is that the boxes all look exactly the same. They're basically a black box with a little code in the corner. And I'm like, this is clearly things are going to get mixed up just because everything looks the same. So I went through and I spent some time basically color coding and giving names to all the shoes on the boxes to differentiate them. So instead of seeing like a big wall of codes, you'd see a big ball of green. And I was sort of thinking at the time logically, if you got the box with the green on it and the box with the pink on it, that's at the very least, it's a marker to say those two things are different. Don't mix them up together. Yeah. And then shortly after I did that, it was probably about a week later or something, the duty manager came up to me and said, "Oh, have you been drawing on the boxes out the back there?" And I thought he was about to say, "Oh, that was such a great idea." Instead, he said, "Can you just stop scribbling on the boxes, please? That's the property. That's a property of the customer when they buy the box, when they buy the shoes." And shortly after that, I thought, oh well, I think what basically the message there is, just do your job. Don't dream. Don't come up with any clever ideas. Just do what you're paid to do, which is go out, get the box, bring it out, go back out again.
Yeah, and keep the system going the way that it is. Exactly.
Indeed. And so your career as a shoe salesman, Nick.
It did. And those boxes of shoes, and when I say a big box of shoes, I'm talking about an enormous box you couldn't lift. You'd need maybe 3 or 4 people to lift. Those boxes of shoes continued, and I imagine all around Australia or the world, they've got the same sort of problem in this massive scale. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's a really obvious point, or it should be. It's amazing how far like manners and common courtesy go. So even like, acknowledging people's work, thanking them for their efforts, doing so publicly, allowing someone to take a bit of credit for something they've done. They're all really, really important. And this is totally anecdotally on my part. People do better with that. Like it doesn't take a lot. And so often, we're talking about culture and this and that. Like these are the things that drive culture, surely, is the way people treat each other. And it shouldn't be that hard in some ways, or those aspects shouldn't be.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's those things that's part of the behavioral shaping. It's those little rewards, the little acknowledgements that affirm the relationship. And this is another aspect of that so many managers and leaders don't understand as well, that real leadership and hence leadership and culture go together. That real leadership is a function of relationship, and the quality of relationship is absolutely critical. Now, that old phrase that people often use that, I don't have to have people like me as long as they respect me. Okay, that's partially true. It's partially true. Well, you don't necessarily have to completely like the person. There has to be some degree of relationship or affinity. Otherwise, if there's no form of a connection or desire to fulfill your end of the relationship, then you're not going to have much leadership in play, so to speak. Now you see this in I think you're both probably well aware, the latest trends over the last couple of years. Another one of the terms that has arisen is, thanks to Google, is the idea of psychological safety in teams. Yeah. And again, it's a set of words that is an emergent property out of the teams, and you can't chase it directly. Now, one of the things that they look at and all the different aspects around trying to produce psychological safety, but one of this has to do with this what you were just mentioning, Cameron, the affirmations about the little acknowledgements that are critical. Now, safety as an emergent property, what does that actually look like? Well, if we jump to an area of neuroscience and we take a look at something known as the polyvagal theory developed by Stephen Porges, one of the things that he points out related to what we're talking about here is he coined this term called neuroceptors. And what they are they're like these neurological receptors that are working for us outside our awareness 24/7, constantly scanning our environment for signs of threat, for signs of danger. And it'll even be happening while you're sleeping, by the way. So if you've ever woken up from a dead sleep because of a sudden noise or a sudden thought that, hey, something might be wrong, that's a classic example of your neuroceptor still at work even while you're sleeping. But it's always scanning. And one of the things that it's scanning for with people in particular is our facial expressions, very subtle micro cues in the face. And it's also scanning for voice tones, subtle changes in voice tones. Now, when people go into a fear-based response or threatened-based response, you'll see when they start dropping down into either a sympathetic mode, a fight or flight mode, or they start moving into what Porges calls a dorsal vagal tone, which is the freeze response. You start to see the facial muscles go flaccid, like it'll start to just drop and become just flat. You'll see very, very little movement in the face, and you'll see more of a monotone starting to occur. And in fact, you'll even start to find that there'll be a lower sounding voice tone that will start to happen as well. They'll drop their voice. Now, what happens if for another human being that perceives this, their neuroceptors pick this up, is very unconsciously, very subtly, all the signals will be firing off saying, this environment is not safe. Mm-hmm. Right? And therefore, without safety, there's no intimacy, there's no reaching out to want to connect. Right? What Porges will call the ventral vagal system or the social engagement system, where I'm feeling safe enough that I'll naturally want to come out and connect. Right?
Yes,
now,
that's fascinating.
Yeah, the demand for psychological safety in teams. All right, you've both sat in on executive team meetings. Most executive team meetings, what are their facial expressions like?
Yeah, I was just going to say. Yeah, I was just going to say your before you were mentioning or we're discussing the culture of a place. I was reflecting on some places I've worked, and I don't think they were bad cultures, but they were different. You just felt differently. But I often use the sort of phrase. It's kind of like you can just sense, or you can always smell that something's not quite right. But you can't put your finger on it.
Yeah.
And I've certainly, it's almost, I know it's almost contagious as well. Like you certainly can sense anxiety in the room, and usually, I can't speak for all government organisations, but it's not just government. It's very conservative, very bureaucratic, and very risk averse. They run their meetings, and everyone is so careful about everything they say.
Yes.
And everyone's on eggshells the whole way through.
Yep.
And it feels very uncomfortable the whole way through. And to be honest, I hadn't actually thought about it, which I perhaps should have as a psychologist. I haven't actually thought about the subtle facial cues and
vocal tones and voice tones.
Yeah, and the voice tones. Yeah.
I suspect this is magnified at least somewhat in the virtual setting as well. Like it feels to me as though we kind of have an opportunity to observe each other in different ways when we're doing, Zoom or Teams meetings or whatever they are. If you're meeting in person, it might be a big room. You might not be as close to people, but there is a kind of, even though we're detached, there's a certain intimacy with people coming up on screen. Maybe it like focuses in on them, and then you do see a facial expression, a tone of voice, something like that.
Yeah,
I think you're paying more attention to it.
Exactly. Yeah, you are. Background also counts as well. The people that are, you're probably aware of this, Nick, people that are in the world of proxemics, and they're looking at the notion of how we relate to space and distance with each other. And oftentimes with online type things, believe it or not, one of the things that helps transcend this feeling of the fact that they're not live, but we can still connect. And part of it is when they are, like yourself, Cam, I can look back and I can kind of see the background that you have, and it tells me a little bit about, the environment that you operate in and things of that nature. And it makes me feel more connected, and it's the subtle little cues that come into play.
Yeah.
for human relations.
It's become like one of the most obvious ones. This is almost like an extreme version of the situation you're describing with the facial expressions, is people switching off their cameras.
Yes.
And not even just switching them off, but quite often, and more often than not, like I think there's a practical aspect to it. I think sometimes people genuinely have them switched off when they're very relaxed, and the people they're catching up with, they don't have to have the camera on because they're just chatting and they want to rest their eyes. That's fair enough. But there is certainly situations I've seen where like people go in and they're giving presentations and they're guests, and they go into a room, and people were telling me about this, and they see this wall of black screens and maybe one or two cameras on. And talking about how intimidating it is, because they're thinking they're either not paying attention, they don't care. There's all these, and they're not subtle messages, are they? A black screen is not a subtle message at all.
I gave a lecture like this and did some university tutorials, and I found it really difficult. I mean, at the best of times, you kind of take it for granted. Not everyone will turn up, and maybe people are having a nap in the back row. You're conditioned for all of that. Yeah. You're even conditioned to them playing on their phones. But there's something, if you come in and there's just this wall of screens, and it's just like you're talking to the dark.
Yeah, I've done an entire day workshop, a full day workshop. This was in Riyadh, in Saudi, and it was at Noor University, which is the largest female university in possibly in the world, right? Not only were the women, the whole audience was women, not only were all the women in a different room, they were in a different building. So I did a whole day talking to a camera lens, right? And then every so often, out will come off the sound system, the translator asking a question or something of that nature. So someone was asking something, and I would talk to this voice that suddenly appeared in the room. But other than that, I'm talking to what apparently was an entire room full of women, and I saw none of them.
Was that a cultural thing, Marvin? Like,
yes, women can't be in the same room as
that's sort of what I assumed. But that's
right.
So that's pre-COVID. That's very interesting.
Marvin, one thing this is probably, maybe it's stating the obvious, but maybe for people listening as well, just to make it clear, we're saying the system, it's not controlled by anything. The system is an emergent property too, right? Just like culture.
Yes, but it is self-organizing around some key things.
But the system itself is obviously not self-aware. It's made up of lots of.
It's self-organizing. Yeah.
Self-organizing. Yeah. So is this basically just the characteristics of the natural world? Is this just the way nature just happens to organize itself?
Yes. Short answer is yes.
Yeah.
It does. But keep in mind, self-organizing does not mean random. It does not mean purely chaotic and ad hoc.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It is self-organizing around a certain set of key rules. So people that are decades ago, there was a term around called part of artificial intelligence, but it was called artificial life, and it was way back where computer programming was quite sophisticated, but nowhere near what it is today. And object-oriented programming was one of the key things. And I was talking with some people from the Santa Fe Institute, and they were showing us clips of things around artificial life, where they would take object-oriented agents, and they would just program it with a certain class of characteristics, and saying they made it operate within a medium. So the background medium could have been characteristics of things like either water or air or land or whatever it might be. And the objects would only interact with other objects under certain characteristics and under certain conditions. And they would just launch, millions of these objects and see how they form together or not. And after millions of iterations, we start to see, lo and behold, right? The computer starts actually showing images of what looks remarkably like living systems that we have today.
Mm.
And you can easily see how some of these systems, these organisms would have gone extinct because they're not exactly best fit. But some of them you go, well, that looks exactly like what we have today. It looks like a spider, or it looks like an octopus, or it looks like a bird, or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
But this is how they can also explain by a handful of local rules, a handful of key organizing rules, usually, again, less than 5. Right?
Mm.
They can start to then throw that into a set of object-oriented programming agents, and they'll start producing what looks like flocks of birds or shoals of fish or beehives, and you start to see really similar things happening in nature by just a handful of local rules that everything is self-organizing around. And cultures like that, when you start to map cultural dynamics, it will be a handful of things holding this whole culture together that if you don't affect, the culture will not shift. So you have to move that locus of control.
So if we took like now the system of a person, so me as a person or another person, I certainly, I think we all can, maybe three of us can reflect on the fact that we're self-organizing, but also we have a level of that homeostasis where we don't change radically from day to day. And sometimes we'll try and experiment new things and they won't stick. Some people will try things like they'll say, I'm going to go on a particular diet, or they might say, I'm going to learn a new skill. I'm going to practice something. And then 2 weeks later, you ask them, how are you going with it? And they go, oh, I just haven't got around to it. Is that an example of the system basically returning back to what it knows?
Exactly right. And the core loops for that, some of the core loops are also pretty well known, right? As to why you keep, that if you don't upgrade these core loops, personal transformation is going to be incredibly difficult. You're going to try it and you're going to keep coming back to your existing habits, etc. One has to do with your identity, your self-concept. If that doesn't upgrade, the things will all come back to who you think you are. Other things are going to be your core beliefs about how you think the world works and what you're capable of and not capable of, etc. Another will be your core values, what you deem are essentially important to you to live by. Right? There's going to be just a handful of things. Your narrative is another one. The major scripts that you're running in your internal dialogues will be the basic kinds of things. There's going to be a handful of things that if you don't upgrade those things, try every change you want, you're going to still be doing your same patterns. Yeah.
Are you, so just following on from that point then, second order change for a person, do they have to go into some sort of crisis? Let's use the word properly. I don't know if that's the right word, but there's a great level of instability personally in order for them to go, right, I've got to change my whole life now. Is that the same sort of thing?
Short answer is yes, but let's unpack that further because there's a lot more sophistication to it, right? For most people, if they are evolving themselves through their personal history over time, at some point, usually the first one or two major life changes or identity upgrades for themselves will be some form of personal crisis, some major drama that's going to happen in their life because they're not skilled with how to facilitate themselves. For some people, they might not have a major change in their life. They might only have it once or twice in their life ever, right? For some people, and I would include myself as one of these, some people go through a lot of life changes, personal changes, transformations, a lot in their lifetime, right? There's a lot of upgrades that happen. And so what happens over time is that level of existential instability and existential angst starts becoming familiar, and it becomes less traumatic. And it starts now moving from, oh no, I'm in crisis. Now it starts getting exciting. Now you start going, oh, I've been here before. Right? I know what's coming. I'm actually I'm in transition right now. And you now have some references of how to actually do this and the fact that you're going to survive this and come out better for it. And as a result, you can actually look forward to some of these types of things and actually work it quite well with a degree of mindfulness or consciousness. Now, in a person, these forms of second order change, one of the other terms is called vertical change. And a vertical change is an evolution in one's consciousness, in one's identity, in the way one has their metacognition and meta reflections about themselves. And in my work in generative learning, it's also about meta cognition. It's the fact that you're not only aware of yourself, you're aware that you're aware, which now instantly evokes a whole nother range of choices. Right? And so this is a critical component in how people evolve and mature over time in consciousness.
There's something I don't know if you've ever listened to another podcast. Joe Rogan's pretty popular, but he often refers to, and I actually have seen research that suggests that I can't remember the name of the chemical, but it comes in magic mushrooms. It's
like psilocybin.
That's it. That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And apparently, for some people who are suffering from certain, like for instance, terrible depression, or they might be trying to give up smoking. There's that people who take that drug can have almost like a different sense of awareness afterwards.
Yeah.
That can
People
actually
with PTSD, I think too, Nick.
Yeah. So that rather than antidepressants, that there might actually be some sort of having like almost like a spiritual experience, or at least a perceived spiritual experience, could actually take you to a different way of thinking or perceiving your life.
Yeah, so I mean, psilocybin has been in use for centuries, and a lot of different tribes would work with magic mushrooms, etc., peyote buttons, etc. For the shamans to actually reach altered states of consciousness. It's the stuff that Timothy Leary started to experiment with LSD, and now the popular one is ayahuasca. And so that's another popular one where there's actually ayahuasca retreats that people will go on to. Because once you can access these altered states, then you have a reference, you have a set of neural patterns to pull on now.
Yeah, there was, and I'm glad we brought this up, because I think not the magic mushrooms, but this idea of individual change, because it was just purely a coincidence. But the example that Cam and I started with, a bit of the tongue-in-cheek Breaking Bad, actually fits in really nicely with that, because that character is diagnosed with lung cancer in the show, and it's the shock and that drives him to almost go to completely rethink and reevaluate his whole existence. It took that when he's in his 50s. He's in his 50s, and his whole life he'd been probably playing it safe, and then it was this moment where he realized, no, this is time to live now. This is the thing. I've got to actually take all these risks now, all the things I never would have done. And it kind of, thinking I think that character probably personifies second order change. Whether it was for good or bad is questionable. Getting into drug manufacturing ice and selling it and doing all of that. That's it's questionable as to whether it actually did him any good anyway in his family. But it certainly he was transformed into something else.
Yeah, I mean, you also highlight a good point, which is second order change also has direction. So it's not just up, so to speak, in terms of spatial metaphors. Not all second order change is always a good thing. So second order change is a straight functional term. It's a second order effect, and which some things can be detrimental. So that what you want to do in terms of the human aspect is in my particular work around generative learning and generative inner work, is helping leaders work through vertical change for themselves that evolves consciousness. So there's greater wisdom in their decision making and their action taking. And this is it requires facilitation for them to move in that direction, as opposed to just saying, oh, all right, or a second order move is great. I'm just going to give up being the CEO, divorce my wife, get a Harley, and become easy rider for the rest of my life. Well, that could be a heap of fun. I don't know if it involves wisdom.
So Marvin, maybe tell us a little bit about, so in terms of in practice, because you've got a lot of experience, and I can obviously imagine you mentoring people and walking them through this process. Is there like I guess a formula that you follow that you would apply to to people right now, for example, who are going through maybe they're running their own business and they're concerned about the future. Maybe they work in an organization, they're a change agent of sorts, and they're thinking, how can I influence now? I'm in my living room on my computer and I've lost all my levers that I used to have. I used to be able to have coffees with people and bump into them on the hallway, and now I'm stuck behind this computer having to schedule in meetings. So there's all these people who are now having to rethink their careers and their businesses. What kind of approaches would you take with them? Is it training? Is it mentoring? All of the above?
Yeah, it's all of the above. They need coaching. First, they need. It's a long, involved process, but the first thing they need are new maps, new models of the world, of how the world is, how structural change works, and their role in it. I'll come back to all this in a bit more granularity in just a moment. So once they have these new maps, It's one thing to know about them, but now we have to personalize and bring that into, into the psychology in which they live. And so that's going to require coaching at that point, where we have to work through the specific issues and how to start upgrading, for lack of better terms, upgrading between the ears as to how you want to now relate to your changing world. And it can also mean, as we spoke about previously, it means upgrading identity, reclarifying your beliefs and assumptions and expectations, reworking your rules and your narratives that's holding you in a particular place, etc. There's a whole entire process around letting go. Transitioning is really important. How you have to, there's a somewhat of a grieving process that also occurs. There's certain things that you just have to let go of and start to recognize, well, while you might get back to some of those things, it won't be like how it was before. So, thanks for the memories, and then let's move on. And then how do you actually have a sense of self-efficacy about how you're going to deal with the future? And you have to have a belief in your capabilities to learn and adapt accordingly. And for business owners, as you pointed out, we take them through a process, myself and Dr. Gary Saliba, we have a process we call Reinvigorating Business. And there's a basic process we take people through is, number one, how to actually understand your environment, sense making around your environment, a perceiving stage as to what's going on around you. Then there's a making sense and an evaluating stage where we now need to look at your business and look at your value proposition. And is it strategically fit to a changing environment? Now, there's a key principle that's involved here, which is, I don't care what happens in the social economic ecosystem that you fit in, massive disruption or whatever, there will always be different forms of supply and demand. There'll always be opportunities. Now, some forms will go extinct, some need upgrading, some entirely new ones will appear, but people are not going to stop buying things, living life, doing business, interacting with each other, etc. They just might need to do it in very different forms under very different conditions. And therefore, if you're attached to a form, if you're attached to what you do and what you sell and the way that you've done it, yeah, you could struggle a lot, right? But instead recognize that if you're a business owner or small business owner, your job isn't to do what you do. Your job is to add value back to your larger ecosystem. As Peter Drucker said, your job is to create and keep a customer. Well, you do that by adding value. So you have to now understand the other side of the equation. From the customer's perspective, what now constitutes value? Value is in the eye of the beholder. What now constitutes value given that their life conditions have changed, that their work conditions have changed, etc.? What now constitutes value? Once you understand that, now you need to take a hard look at your business, or if you're doing it individually, take a hard look at your life and start to go, is my business fit for purpose now? Or is it now obsolete? Have we gone past the use by date, right? Where the form is now obsolete. And now you have to now redesign, think and design and redesign, upgrade your business model. You're thinking of how business work, what constitutes a good business, etc. You're going to then also need to upgrade new skills, new tools, new methods, and you're going to have to learn how to have adaptive product and service offerings. It's basically, the world of lean startups and agile thinking is just prime for all of this, of how do you actually release things based on hypotheses testing while you're making money, right? So you can't do a classic waterfall approach. You're going to go broke in this way. But you're constantly testing because your environment keeps changing. So you might have struck on a U-boot winner product service offering now, and in 12 months, it could be obsolete again, or as the economy fluctuates and restabilizes in different ways. So your whole business model has to be geared up towards real-time adaptiveness, as close to real-time as possible, and try and minimize all these long delays between concept to offering. But you have to gear up accordingly. And I liken it to, if you think of a sailboat, right? A sailboat, these are all heuristical, they're navigational, they're based on heuristics. And if you look at a sailboat, right? A sailboat does not have the mast permanently fixed, right? In one position. It's built on a swivel, so it can actually pivot because they know the environment's going to change. The wind is going to change. It's geared up. A good boat was geared up. Sailboat is geared up to be able to change the sail while you're sailing, right? I can drop it and put up a new sail and add other ones.
Yeah.
The rudder is geared to turn because I know I'm going to have to turn the boat as the tide shifts. There's a keel on the boat because the boat's going to rock as the waves. It's geared up to be adaptive to its environment because its environment is constantly changing. Most businesses are not sailboats. And so when the environment starts changing around them, they wonder, wow, it's so hard to turn this ship around. Yeah, because you're geared up, right? Not for adaptation. You're geared up for stability in an environment that's constantly changing. That's called insanity, right?
Actually, a really big ship takes a very long time to come to a stop.
Yeah.
If you've got like an oil tanker or a cruise liner or something like that, and you throw it in reverse, it could take a very long time to actually bring that thing to a stop. So,
and so if you think
some of the same with companies, the bigger they are, maybe the harder.
Exactly, right. So it's what the key is a designer of your business or of your life, your career, etc. You need to think, if I'm now in a transitional, disrupted economy, and all signs are saying our economy is not going to stabilize for a very long time, right? Don't think we're going to go back to a stable economy anytime soon. And by anytime soon, I mean like probably a couple of generations. Right? And so what's now going to happen is you have to now gear up and think, all right, my career. So maybe my career was an engineer. Oh, okay, well, maybe actually the core thing is my capacity to learn technical things. And as new technical things arise, how do I learn quickly? And it's not a form of engineering, right? But I can have an engineering mindset and apply it in a range of different ways. I know how to sail. So you have to rethink your business, rethink your career, rethink how you think business works. And there's going to come a time very soon where a lot of businesses are now starting to wise up, and they need employees that can contribute to innovation in terms of value propositions, innovation in terms of how we do business and how we do our work, innovations in ways and how we challenge how we used to do things, but now let's make sure we're fit for purpose. And if you're an employee and you're thinking, all right, I'm struggling because it's not the way I used to do it, you're going to keep struggling, not because it's not the way you used to do it, it's because nothing's changing between your ears. What has to change is what's between your ears to go adaptive, because that's the world you live in. Right? If you don't fit your world, nature usually wins. You'll go extinct.
I kind of wonder, Marvin, if there's an element of the 5 stages of grief. With change. You've got people in denial. So they think this is all just going to return back to the way it was. We just got to give it a little bit of time, and then everything's going to be back to normal again. Whatever normal is, that's probably the denial side of things. And I think you referred to one before, which is there's an element of grief for some people, because they're realizing that there's certain things that they enjoyed doing or they thought that they were going to be doing in their careers, and they have to let that go. And that's a promising sign that's natural. And then, of course, then it sounds like what you're doing in many ways is also guiding them towards acceptance.
Yes.
But they can probably only do that once you've got, I think, as you've referred to in the past with me, is that it's almost like a new language or a new way of looking at the problem, because you can't break out of the problem using your same old toolkit. That's why you need some external support and external help.
That's right. You need a meta language to be able to talk about the system. Otherwise, you're trapped by the language of the system, and all you do is your thinking will keep perpetuating the current way of thinking. As I mentioned as well around the different maps. You need maps of what's actually occurring, and you're right in terms of the letting go process. But it's, as you said, people that might be denying, and they might kind of go, well, we'll just wait for things to go back to the way that it was. One of the things that Dr. Saliba and I often do when we're presenting the reinvigorating business model, what we call the adaptive value fit model, is we point out to them, do you actually think that the pandemic, that the COVID-19 pandemic disruption around the world, do you reckon that this is the last we will see of major economic disruptions? Do you think that we will not have to address things like climate change? Do you think that another pandemic may not occur? Do you think that all the economies around the world are going to stabilize all at the same time in the same way, especially if you've got value chains going back to China, manufacturing, etc., right? Do you think that, oh, by the way, since we have to pay for so much of this, that we're now in the multi-billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to pay for this, do you think that government just happens to have that money and nothing's going to happen around taxes? Do you think we don't have to deal with the issues around of the systemic effects of lockdown, like depression rates, suicides? Apparently, I heard one stat in the U.S. that reported around child abuse cases tripled, right, in some areas, right? And so, do you think we don't have to deal with any of these kinds of things, right? Do you actually think we're going to go back and stabilize like how it was 8 months ago. Right? You have to upgrade your thinking as to what's going on around you.
Yeah, aside from the world wars, I can't think of anything that's been as catastrophic as this.
Yeah.
In recent times, I mean in the last 100 years.
Yeah. And, and you see the scenarios that's occurring, but particularly out of, well, for right now, since this is a general podcast, we'll keep the country nameless. There are huge advancements of all sorts of military advancements, etc. And this is the other one, which everybody should be aware of. If they're not, you cannot be in denial of this one. Do you not think cybersecurity issues are not going to be massively disruptive?
Yeah.
Right?
They already are.
I really think the economy is going to stabilize anytime soon. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the cybersecurity one, I think there's a few there, isn't there, that we've all been in a little bit of denial about. Not everyone, because some people were beating the drum over certain issues for many years, but certainly pandemics, I think we all probably were confident that, yes, we heard that they're problematic, but we've seen a few come and go very quickly, and that's probably what will keep happening. Cybersecurity issues seem pretty localized until all of a sudden everybody's private information's online and they go...
And the telcos go down, which they have been.
Yeah. So it's, you're absolutely right. Marvin, just with the interest of time, I wouldn't mind just maybe if you could let us know what... Because you were mentioning a program that you're working on with your colleague, and you'll have to repeat his name again. I've forgotten it. Was
Dr. Gary Saliba.
That's it, Dr. Gary Saliba. And so is that something you can actually access online?
Yes, we are producing it now. We do a range of things with it, from facilitated online workshops for those that really want to get into it and work there, reinvent and upgrade, evolve their current business model. So we'll work with their leadership teams accordingly. We also have a playbook of strategic focus questions, and we're going to release all of that in 2021, early 2021. The major thing is, if you want to be notified of all of that, then get onto my website and make sure that we are on our list. There's also areas around generative critical thinking for leaders, to be able to, second order leaders, to actually understand how to work through false narratives and things of that nature, so you're not making decisions based on some assumptions that are unfounded. I've got things around the generative inner work coaching, particularly those that do executive coaching work, and you're working with executives that are in transition and need to upgrade between the years. And we also got coming up a second order systems thinking program as well, which will probably launch about mid 2021. And there is a neurobehavioral modeling online certification as well for those that want to learn about how to use neurobehavioral modeling to facilitate second order or development of second order intellectual property.
Very good.
When you mentioned to me when we spoke the other day, and you said you've been keeping quite busy, you weren't kidding, right?
That's right.
Marvin, that was fantastic. As always, always love chatting to you, because I always feel as though I now have to go and reevaluate many aspects of not only my life but my business and many other things, and look at the world with a different lens again. So I have a feeling that if I just keep talking to you, it'll rub off eventually, and and I'll be coming up to you saying, look at this fantastic innovation I invented. But thanks so much for coming along to the show today, Marvin. It was really great talking.
Thank you, Marvin. It was fascinating.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Cam. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, Marvin. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
All right, Mr. Hawker, we'll wrap up.
We'll wrap up.
Okay, so what we normally do at the end is we talk about a book that you're reading, and last week it was Jekyll and Hyde, and then the week. Right. Yeah, and then or a television show. So I'll let you go first again. You seem to be I'm reading Dracula, but I won't discuss Dracula today because I'm going to wait till I actually finish it. But as I think I said last week, I'm on a bit of a gothic horror kick at the moment, so I'll probably come back to that one in the next episode. I have been watching, I will admit, The Crown on TV, which is a very popular show at the moment, and it sort of got me to thinking, because I've read some reviews and
critiques of it. So for those of you who don't know, The Crown sort of tells the story of the Queen and her family sort of over the last 50, 60 years. And it's a very glamorous sort of soap opera, really, like historical soap opera. So it takes real events in broad brush strokes and then fills in a lot of blanks. So we know that Prince Charles and Princess Diana got married, and then that marriage eventually broke down, but we don't know all the conversations that happened behind the scenes, right? We know some of them and bits and pieces from eyewitnesses, but it takes a huge amount of poetic license. And there's been some criticism of that, some pushback of that about the show in the last week or so, which I found interesting because it makes me think about maybe how we relate to history. So a lot of us consume history through, fiction, through books and movies and TV shows, and actually more and more games now as well. So my partner's playing a new Call of Duty game at the moment called Call of Duty Cold War, and it looks really interesting. But then I got annoyed because I said, well, there were no zombies in the Cold War, actually, but like zombies get sort of inserted into everything. And The Crown has actually always done what it's doing now, going right back to season 1. But the big difference is that a lot of the people who are on the show now are still alive. Or they've only died fairly recently. So if they're being unfairly portrayed, perhaps there's a bit more pushback. So there's a bit of, some people think Prince Charles is painted unfavourably in the show and it's a little bit unfair, and Princess Diana's painted more sympathetically, and maybe they haven't got the balance quite right there. So I just found that interesting, the way we remember, or the way we relate to history. Like if your knowledge of World War II is based on World War II movies, for example, you'd think maybe the Americans won the war all by themselves. The British didn't necessarily have much of a look in, and the Soviets, who were they? Weren't. They don't really get much of a look in those sort of things either.
That's right. Well, if you based it off the Indiana Jones movies, it would have been Indiana Jones probably had a part in it somehow, and the Nazis were mostly interested in supernatural sort of artifacts, and
That's a good point. Yeah. But actually, I grew up loving the Indiana Jones movies. If anything, those movies sort of gave me a bit of a passion to go and study history seriously, which is sort of something I did. So that's a good thing, I think. But then if you end up with this, there's a great quote in The Simpsons about Grandpa Simpson, relates some history and it's all wrong. It's about the Wright brothers winning the Civil War or something like that. And Bart says to him, how do you know so much history? And he says, I mostly piece it together from sugar packets. So this is sort of, we get these little bits and pieces of history. And even the way we teach history in schools is actually quite fragmented. We don't teach it much as a sequential thing anymore. We seem to focus on particular points in history and maybe study it thematically. So kind of relate themes, which, is valid, but there's something to be said for sort of learning broad arcs of narrative history and then deep diving in from there.
Yeah, I actually we started watching The Crown a while ago, so the first couple of seasons, and I agree that there were certain things which I wasn't familiar with in history that it called attention to, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting, and I looked it up online and read about it because I thought that's fascinating. I didn't have any memory or knowledge of that happening in history, and it may have not been 100% accurate, but at least it inspires you to kind of look at the source and find out what really happened.
Yeah, I mean, there's one episode where they set it around the moon landing, I think from the last season.
Oh, that's right, yes.
And they sort of paint Prince Philip as having this sort of roughly midlife crisis around about the time of the moon landing. And I know, I think it is correct in the sense that Prince Philip at a certain point in his life struggled with the role he had to play as sort of second fiddle to the Queen, so that's valid. But there's a scene in that where he's a pilot, which is something that's just true. He was a amateur pilot, and he's flying at quite a high altitude and he sees the moon. And at one point it looks like he's actually going to try and get his airplane to the moon. It's almost like Prince Philip's flying to the moon as his midlife crisis. And that was sort of absurd. But it was, it's good TV, right?
It is good TV. The other one, which is also good TV, which is another one of those ones that a lot of people watched years ago, and this is much trashier as well, is the Tudors.
Oh yeah, I remember that show.
Yeah, that got me very interested in, it's King Henry.
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII. King Henry VIII's wives, and we're watching that. Like I always knew that the bit of the history there, like everyone knows the rhyme and knows a bit about that he killed his wives. But
well, some of them.
Yeah, and there was a couple. Yeah, indeed, that's right. He killed
others
three.
Died broken hearts.
Was it? Yeah, I think it was. Or maybe it was only 2 he killed.
He had 2 beheaded, and
and 1 died at childbirth. That's right.
That's right. But they didn't tend to do too well. No. Well, I mean that's interesting because that shows this idea of Henry VIII actually, as a young man, was a tall, athletic, very good-looking, typical Renaissance prince. And until shows like The Tudors came along, we tended to remember the old fat Henry.
Yes.
So there's movies, I think it's Charles Lawton, maybe back in the 1950s or something, had these portrayals of Henry really towards the end of his life. That's who he was. And then the Tudors played on this idea and showed him as this, like, you know, ripped, good-looking, athletic guy, and made it really sexed it up too, which again is television.
They also introduced a couple of the stories that may or may not explain that he may have actually been had some sort of brain damage. There's theories around that. There was one where I think he falls off his horse or something, and
yes, where he's jousting. I think.
I think there's a couple of events that happen when he's young, and they suggested that he became very impulsive and his personality changed. Which is consistent with I think it's frontal lobe damage. Like if you get that, they've shown your personality can radically change when you get if you get like a brain injury. Whether or not that's true, it's very hard to piece together the past though when you don't have the videos.
I'll point you towards another Henry VIII related book and also TV show. It's very well known now as the Wolf Hall trilogy by Hilary Mantel, and that it's the story of Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry's sort of prime minister or chief advisor, who rose from very, very humble origins. And it's historical fiction done really, really well. It's sort of a literary version of the Tudors to some extent, I suppose, but I certainly enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Well, I think we'll probably wrap up now. I think we've had a pretty intensive discussion. I mean, last week was pretty intense because we sort of threw out a question for Gemma, which was if the whole world is a system, then what's the overall purpose of the world then?
Yeah, and it was almost a meaning of life question, wasn't it?
Yeah, we should have actually thrown that one to Marvin and just throw him off his game at the start, just to give him a tough one.
Yeah.
But next week, I believe we're actually moving away from complex systems, and we'll be talking to a person who works as a locksmith.
Yes, good.
Looking at a very different type of role and the complexities that you have as I guess you call a frontline emergency worker, one of those workers that is always employed even during pandemics. There's always a need to get into your house if you lose your keys. And so
that's a whole interesting thing in itself, like who's an essential worker, and locksmiths certainly are. I'm looking forward to getting into that one.
Yes, that's with Adam next week. Great. All right. Thanks, Cam. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Nick.